that's pretty cool that you were kind of an early adopter to it.
Back in 2012,
yeah.
I just thought, well, who could I actually try and see would be interested in talking to me, some guy in Australia, about their career. And just by chance, I don't even know how, but I got into a game of Words with Friends. There's an app on the phone
yeah,
called Words
I used to play that.
Okay. And I was somehow playing against Bill Wennington, and I didn't actually know if it really was Bill Wennington or not. So after a few games back and forwards, I messaged him just behind the scenes and said, "Is this really the Bill Wennington?" He replied something along the lines of, "Yes, it is. If it's not, then my whole life's been a lie," or something like that. And
then you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
So I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you made the pass. Yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
welcome to episode 88. Thanks for joining me. Today, for a change, I'm the guest. My friend in Dallas, Mike Frailer, recently invited me on his Forgotten Maverick podcast. As the name cleverly suggests, he chats with Dallas Mavericks players of years gone by. We discuss how our podcasts came to be and reminisce about our love of NBA history. I also talk about my 1994 and 1995 trips to the USA and how luck wasn't on my side. Both times I visited the States, Michael Jordan was in the midst of his first retirement. Mike's twin brother, Jeff, believe it or not, has his own NBA history podcast named Forgotten Lakers. Are you sensing a theme here? If you enjoy my podcast, you'll certainly enjoy listening to Mike and Jeff's. Search for Forgotten Maverick and Forgotten Lakers on your podcast player of choice. Towards the end of the episode, I'll share another great podcast review. You can add yours by visiting inallairness.com/review. Show notes for this episode will be available at inallairness.com/88. Now, onto the show.
For your listeners, if you end up sharing this, would you mind just introducing yourself and talking about your podcast and your website?
First of all, of course, I'll be sharing this. I love NBA history, so it's a real thrill just to chat with another fan of NBA history. My name's Adam Ryan. I live in Australia. I'm 43 years old, which is quite a sobering thought when I actually do think about that. My podcast is called In All Airness, and that is a name which I've sort of waxed and waned on liking and not liking over the years, but I'm pretty much stuck with it now. It's a Michael Jordan era podcast, focusing mostly on the 1980s and 1990s. However, I have had guests who played earlier than that, and probably most notably would be the great Rick Barry, who is one of my favourite conversations that I've had to date. So I go back to all sort of eras, but primarily focus on the 80s and 90s. And I just can't get enough of it. And so much so that I actually created the podcast because I couldn't find one that did what I wanted to hear.
That's really impressive. And that's actually kind of similar to what my brother and I are doing. My brother's a diehard Lakers fan, even though we both grew up here in Dallas. But I initially created an Instagram just posting pictures of random former Mavs and trying to come up with funny captions. And then, he kind of did something similar with the Lakers. And then luckily he had to create a podcast at work. So he learned how to do it. So he said, I think I can maybe start creating a podcast with these former Lakers. And I kind of had some little Instagram friendships with some former Mavericks. So that helped me out with starting it too. So, but to get back to your point, that's kind of what my brother wanted, is he wanted something where he could hear about specifically something about his favorite team in a NBA history aspect, because, you see a lot of generic things out there, but when there's a void or something, he wanted to fill it. So I think that you and him could relate on that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's worked out pretty well for us, and we're both having a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, fantastic. And I've listened to some of his episodes as well. I primarily focus on the guys who played in 1998 or earlier. Yeah, you guys both put out a great product, so it's really fun to see a new episode pop up and think, oh, great, I can hear a story from a guy that is not often talked about nearly as much as some of the high-profile players that when they do make appearances on podcasts, some of these really high-profile guys, they might just rehash the same stories they've told verbatim for the last 20 years. And whilst that's great to hear that, don't get me wrong, I still enjoy it. It's really good to hear some of these lesser-known players from eras that are long gone talk about things that they experienced either on the court or even just from the bench watching. So I really enjoy that. And that was one of the things that I try to still focus on to this day. I'll track down guys. You could say it's stalking, I guess. I track down guys online as best I can. And the more obscure, sometimes the better. And they often have some great stories that they've never been able to tell just because they haven't had the media spotlight flashed on them so much since their retirement.
Absolutely. And, I do some of the light to moderate stalking as well, trying to get some guests booked. If someone says yes and then they don't get back to me, I'll follow up every couple of weeks until something happens. I think it took me about 6 or 7 months to get Gary Trent to come on, but it finally happened. For the first time he said yes to when we actually recorded.
That can be the case. You try and be as polite as you can, and these guys are doing us a massive favor, of course. I might be speaking for you here, but I get so excited in the lead up to actually chatting to these guys. So when a conversation does fall through and doesn't actually go ahead, I get kind of bummed out. So it's good to be able to follow it up and get them on the show. But I started doing the podcast, I think it was about mid to late 2012. And the only sort of podcast I was listening to then that was NBA related was Bill Simmons, obviously the BS report.
Right.
Occasionally he'd have guests on there that were former players, but that was few and far between. And of course, most people know about his love of the Boston Celtics and Larry Legend. But I just thought, well, I can't actually find a podcast that's doing what I want to hear. So why not just try and create one? And whilst the first 20 or so episodes that I put out, my microphone quality was terrible. I think I was actually just talking into a webcam and I sounded like I was 3 rooms away underwater. It was terrible. But the guest audio wasn't too bad. And obviously I got a better microphone after a little while. And yeah, I've just been going forward since and absolutely love doing it. It's a passion project. Obviously don't get paid for it, but I just love doing it and couldn't imagine not doing it at this point.
I can completely relate to that. But I was going to say 2012, that's pretty early for the podcasting, I would think. I wasn't listening to too many at the time. Probably Bill Simmons and then the Basketball Jones when they were in Toronto. That's the year that I believe I discovered them, or maybe it was 2011. Either one of those years. But that's pretty cool that you were kind of an early adopter to it.
Back in 2012,
yeah.
I just thought, well, who could I actually try and see would be interested in talking to me, some guy in Australia, about their career? And just by chance, I don't even know how, but I got into a game of Words with Friends. There's an app.
Yeah, I used to play that.
Okay. And I was somehow playing against Bill Wennington. And I didn't actually know if it really was Bill Wennington or not. So after a few games back and forwards, I messaged him just behind the scenes and said, "Is this really the Bill Wennington?" And he replied something along the lines of, "Yes, it is. If it's not, then my whole life's been a lie," or something like that. And I found it hilarious. And then from that point on, I just sort of started messaging him saying, "Look, I'd love to invite you on. I'm a massive fan of old school basketball. I live in Australia. You don't owe me anything, but what are the chances of us perhaps chatting one day about your career?" And I said something like, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being never and 10 being definitely, where do you sort of rank in terms of the possibility of chatting with me? And I think he replied back and said maybe a 5 or a 6. So I thought, oh, wow, that's a possibility. And it then eventually led to the point where I thought, well, okay, let's do it. So that's when I first started doing all my research and delving into the archives online to find as much as I could. Plus, I've obviously watched a lot of games of his over the years, given he was on the world champion Bulls for quite a few seasons there and won multiple titles. And then eventually we worked out a date. I chatted online on Skype with him. It was a video chat, and I was freaking out because I could see him the whole time. And this was back in late 2012, and he was my very first guest. So, and he has a link to the Dallas Mavericks, no less, as well, mate.
Yes, he does. And, I've tweeted at him a couple times, seeing if I could potentially do a show with him, and he's just never responded. So maybe I'll get him at some point. But, that's where he started his career, and he was a part of some pretty successful Maverick teams, in those mid to late 80s.
Yeah, it definitely was. And I did ask him about that and talked about the reunion rowdies, I think they were
Yeah.
referred to as, the crowd back in those days. And he has some fond memories about his time in Dallas. But for what it's worth, I'll try and reach out to him. He might just ignore my comments now that we've done and dusted. But I occasionally do have a bit of interaction with him. So we'll see how it goes, mate. I'll try and help you out as best I can to at least get him to get in touch with him. We'll see how it goes from there.
I'd appreciate that. One thing I've noticed about your podcast is that you delve deep into specific bowl seasons and Michael Jordan's career, and you talk about just like maybe like a week out of 1987 and talk about specific games. How does that process work? I mean, do you have like a vast collection of games on film, or are you just scouring Basketball Reference? What is your process for doing those type of episodes? Because actually, I really like the idea of it. I just wouldn't even know where to begin on doing something like that.
Thank you. I've done, I think, 3 full seasons thus far. We've covered, and we being my great friend down in Melbourne, here in Australia, Aaron Steen. Hello to Aaron if you're listening. Just in relation to that, he's been my co-host since we started doing these season-by-season recaps. We started with 1985, which was Jordan's rookie season, and we've done a recap of, I think it was 30 episodes about the 85 season. We did about 15 episodes for the 86 season, where Jordan was mostly out injured with a broken foot. And then we've finished the 87 season as well, and now we're doing the 88 season. So we're trying to coincide with 30-year anniversaries of said NBA season for Michael Jordan. So we're currently in the midst of the 88 season. It involves most of what you suggested. Lots of Basketball Reference research. It's a fantastic website, and I can't speak highly enough of how good it is. Also, I delve into the archives of newspapers online. There's a newspapers.com website, which is just phenomenal. You've got to pay a membership. I think it's maybe $50 or $60 per 6 months or something like that. But It's really worth it because you can then sign in and you can access all these newspapers that aren't available through Google searches. So you just find a wealth of information that way. That's been very helpful. And as you mentioned about the games, I'm a massive Michael Jordan collector. I've lost track of how many games I do have, but it's close to 1,000 of his games on DVD or videotape. I think he played, I know he played 1,251 games in his career, including playoffs, and I think 13 All-Star games. So technically 1,264 games. I've got about 1,000 of those on video or DVD.
And did you just record those yourself and then transfer them to DVD?
Here in Australia, we had very limited NBA access on television.
Oh, yeah. I talked with Lee Ellis about his limited access growing up, actually, several months ago.
Yeah, I listened to that episode with Lee. It was very solid. 2 thumbs up.
Thank you.
Now, in relation to TV here in Australia, late 80s, we only had, I think from memory, it was only maybe 1 game a week, pretty limited. And then into the early 1990s, the Australian National Basketball League, which was spearheaded by the great Andrew Gaze, that really took off in popularity, continued on from the 1980s when it was popular, became huge in the early 1990s through the mid-1990s, and that was coupled with the rise of the NBA here in Australia because we started to get more games on TV. There was a lot of hype about the obviously the Dream Team and whatnot taking part in the 92 Olympics, so it really came on in the 90s, but most of my collection's actually been through trades with collectors who recorded those games back in the day. In the US, and you can find still to this day some collectors online who have just incredible amount of games, and you just end up amassing a collection through trade after trade after trade, and you try and get upgrades on quality because there's a lot of different versions of certain games going around. But still to this day, there's close to 200 or more Jordan games which just have not been even seen by anybody since the day they actually first aired. They don't exist in the trading hobby, so it's quite remarkable to this point that much of his career, and particularly it's mostly 85 through about 88, 89, there's a lot of unseen Jordan greatness which we're yet to experience.
That's incredible, and I think that's really, really cool that you have such a vast collection. Did you ever have the privilege of seeing Jordan play in person?
Oh, no, I did it. There's a quick backstory if you'd like me to elaborate.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, okay. In 1993, just after the Bulls had won their 3rd championship in a row, here in Australia, there was an NBA tour that was organised for a group of about 20 or so people to head over to the States during the 1994 season to watch some NBA games. And I was all over it. And my mum and dad were very generous in helping pay for that trip for me because I was only This is showing my age. I was just 18 at the time. And it was my first time overseas. I was so excited. We just paid the deposit. Well, Mum and Dad had paid the deposit for the trip. And this is probably around about September-ish, August, September of 93.
Oh, I know where this is going. Yeah.
Yeah, you know where this is going. Before we know it, Jordan announces his retirement in early October. His father obviously was tragically killed in the months preceding that. I still went over and had a magnificent time on the trip. Took a lot of photos of everything basketball. I don't think I'm in any photo at all. It's all basketball stadiums or the Basketball Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, the Chicago Bulls game that we went to see did not feature Mr. Jordan. He was retired at that time.
Yeah.
So we saw the Bulls play the 76ers at Chicago Stadium, which is now since demolished.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was demolished in 1995 before they went to the United Center. And yeah, it was a great experience to be there. Really cool that I got to witness one of the Bulls starting lineup introductions with the great Ray Clay on the PA announcement.
Absolutely.
Who was a former guest on my show. So that was pretty cool to 20-something years later to be able to speak with Ray Clay. So yeah, great experiences. 6 games in about 2 weeks. I went to the Great Western Forum, Boston Garden, Madison Square Garden, Chicago Stadium. Saw some magnificent players, but missed out on Jordan. So a tale of woe.
I mean, that's still really cool that you got to do that. I mean, unfortunate timing, but I mean, you got to see Chicago Stadium, one of the legendary stadiums in the country. So that's pretty impressive. I actually used to live up in Chicago, and went to several games at the United Center. I lived there between 2010 and 2014. So I went to every time the Mavericks came, I went, and then I'd go to games with friends, or even drove to Milwaukee once to see the Mavericks play the Bucks on a Saturday night. So I went to a lot of games up there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so you're a diehard Mavs fan for sure, showing it there as well. And the other quick wrinkle to that trip was in 1995, in February, I think it was 95, I went over to the States on a holiday for about 2 weeks with my then girlfriend, who we're no longer with. But that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
Went over to the States with her for 2 weeks, and we went and saw the Lakers play the Sonics at the Great Western Forum. A great trip, and we got back from that trip in late February. And within about 3 weeks or so, Jordan announced that he's back and he was in the NBA again. So when you live in Australia, it's quite disheartening that you have to go that far to go over and see an NBA game. All these scenarios and circumstances have to play out for you to be able to see these players and be there. And I was there twice in the space of barely 12 months. And both times Jordan was retired either side of that period of time.
That's really funny. I actually did get to see him in person, but during his Wizards days.
Okay, fantastic. At Dallas, or did you?
In Dallas, yeah. I believe it was the 2003 season, so his final year. He had like 15 points, and I mean, he played okay, but it was still cool just seeing him out there.
I bet it would have been pretty much a packed arena, was it?
Oh yeah. I mean, well, and also the Mavs were actually really good at that time. Definitely one of the places to be in Dallas in the early 2000s. It was a packed house for sure.
Yeah, true. I suppose they were only a few seasons from then they were going to be in the NBA Finals.
Going back to your show, do you have like a ultimate guest that you'd like to have but you just haven't been able to book? Like, is there someone that you're trying to track down, or that would basically be just like a dream come true?
Well, surprising as it may sound, Dave Corzine is probably my white whale, and I'm not joking. He is a figure that I've been obsessed with since 1989, because that was one of the first games that was on TV here in Australia that I recorded on videotape and I kept, was Jordan's The Shot in 1989 at Cleveland. Of course, Game 5 of the 1989 playoffs against the Cavs. Dave Corzine was in that game, and for some reason, I don't know why, I was always gravitated to Dave Corzine. I was always curious about who this player was on such a great young team that was just building its way into becoming, obviously, a superpower of the NBA in the early 90s. But Dave left the Bulls just before that championship run began. But he actually played the most games for Chicago in the 1980s. So that's a great little fact. Not many people know he played more games than anybody in the Bulls franchise throughout the 1980s. And there's a couple of times I've got close to being able to get in touch with him to organise a recording. And I believe we did have very brief contact quite a few years ago in relation to setting something up. There's things that just fall through, and unfortunately that period of time escaped. But I'm still on the hunt for Dave Corzine, so you never know one day. But aside from Dave, I mean, there's plenty of other guys that I'd love to get on there. Some are more high-profile, well-known guys, but certainly some of the other guys from the early 90s Bulls championship teams would be fantastic. It'd be great to chat with Scottie Pippen.
Oh, yeah.
Guys like Craig Hodges, Cliff Levingston. I mean, I've got a lot of Bulls-centric in terms of a bias. I love the Bulls of that era and guys that were just on the roster at that time. It doesn't necessarily have to be to do with Jordan. It's just to be the Jordan era. It's not all things Jordan that I'm obsessed with. It's just that era. It's the greatness of the NBA at that time, particularly the 80s into the early to mid-90s.
Oh, yeah.
It just fascinates me. So there's plenty of guys that I'd love to get on the show. And I'm in discussions with a few guys behind the scenes, but you just never know. I don't want to jinx things by saying I'm chatting to somebody hoping they're going to be on the show. But fingers crossed, I guess, that some of those guys could come to fruition.
Absolutely, yeah. I've got a few guests myself that I'd like to get, and one of them is a former Bull / former Mav from the early 90s, Scott Williams. Speaking of like stalking, like we said earlier, I talked to like his secretary a couple times, and she said, okay, well, I'll pass along the message. And then I did get his corporate email address, but he never responded. So I may call again in another month or two or send another email, see what happens. But he spent half of a year, like towards the end of his NBA career here in Dallas. So that's why I'd like to talk to him. But I know he was a part of the first three-peat in Chicago.
Yeah, his first 3 seasons in the league were 3 titles, which is pretty phenomenal when you think about it. Coming out of North Carolina, of course, one of the great colleges too. You know what's going to happen, mate. Only in the near future, we're going to be probably issued with digital restraining orders from some of these guys.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, that's that might be the case, but hopefully I'll get a few more episodes in before that happens.
That's true. Try and do a few bulk recordings in the meantime, just in case.
Yeah. I love your show and your website and everything. The way you've kind of found a niche for yourself, I think it's really impressive, and I've just been a big fan of it since I discovered it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I like to just refer to myself as the NBA history guy in Australia. There's only a few of us that can sort of say that mantle, and there's another great friend of mine that I haven't mentioned yet, Todd Spear, who wrote a book about the late great Drazen Petrovic, and Todd is another guy that I actually first met just via email history back in about 2000. And we emailed for years and years online, back and forwards. It took us maybe 10 plus years before we actually met in person. And he's another one of my great friends. He's an NBA historian like a few others. There's a few of us here out in Australia. But just one thing I wanted to ask you about was, how has your fascination or your interest perhaps in the Mavericks of old come to grow over the time since you've done your podcast? Because I listened to one of your episodes and I've singled it out. I've since gone into iTunes to have a look. It was episode 29 with a guy called Howard Wright.
Yes.
And I think that was one of the most enjoyable podcast episodes I've heard in any podcast.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm not getting paid to say that. I'm just having a quick read of the description. It says, former Mav Howard Wright joined the podcast. He played 3 games for the Mavericks in the 91 season, one of 3 short stops in his career. Just incredible that you uncover guys like this, and this is exactly why I love the game, and particularly the old school stuff. He had some tremendous stories and was so well spoken, and I just enjoyed the episode thoroughly. So when you've never probably heard of the guy prior to finding his name and then researching about him, like how has your appreciation for the game sort of developed chatting to these guys who are part of the franchise history of Dallas?
That's a really good question, and you are correct. I had never heard of Howard Wright before this past spring. I became a Mavs fan in 1995, Jason Kidd's rookie year. I was 8 years old at the time. So anything pre-95, I've studied enough NBA in my life to know names and certain events about the Mavs, but it wasn't over the past year where I started looking at rosters and looking at trades that happened or looking at guys' stories. And then in booking things for the podcast, there's a great site, mavswiki.com, and it basically has, up until about 2016 or 2017, every single player that ever played for Dallas, no matter whether it was one game or one season or for a 10-day contract, whatever. You can search by alphabetical letters, or you can search by people that wore jersey numbers. And so I think I was just looking at the W's, and I said, Howard Wright, who is that? And so I said, I'll see if I can find him online, and I found him on LinkedIn. I agree. That was one of my favorite episodes, and Howard and I have actually kept in touch some. My appreciation for the game has grown so much because as a lifelong NBA fan, you grow up with posters of these guys that were legends, and you're collecting cards of these legends and everything. But then in the backgrounds of these cards, you might see someone who don't know who he is, but at one point in time, he's one of the 400 greatest basketball players in the world. I love hearing their stories, whether it's something funny that happened in practice or something very important that happened in their lives that unfolded for them to get to that level. Because, I mean, it's such a small percentage of people ever make it to the top of their craft. And, you know, they might have not been the most successful at that time, but, like, they would mop the floor with 99% of the world, over 99%.
That's absolutely fantastic to hear you say that, because that's how, and a couple of times on my podcast, I've said as much. These guys are the top, you know, as you said, 400 players in the world. They have every right to be sitting there on the bench. They might get 1 minute, they might get 41, but from night to night, they would absolutely dominate if they took on anybody else. So it's interesting that you're also of the same opinion there. So that's great to hear. But yeah, I think when you hear these stories from guys who have such basically a cup of coffee in the NBA, they often have stories and a viewpoint that's very rarely ever expressed or you hear about, because they often fade, rightly or wrongly, just into oblivion, unfortunately, because they weren't one of those main 4 or 5 starters or a superstar at that particular time. So, yeah, it's good to hear, mate.
One more thing about Howard Wright, a little bit of a cool story here. He texted me a few months after we recorded, and he said, hey, like, I'm trying to find a picture of myself with Dallas. He said, I can't find it anywhere. Do you know where I could find something like that? And I have a friend that used to work in the Mavs video department. I emailed him. He's familiar with the podcast. And I said, I'm trying to do a favor for one of my guests. Do you have any archives or anything of Howard Wright, 1991? He said, I can't find any photos of him with Dallas. I found a photo of him with Orlando, but I do have a copy of his press release from when we signed him to a 10-day contract. He said, I could send that. And so I asked Howard. He said, yeah, I'd really appreciate that. So I was able to get that for Howard's mom. You know, it just talks about him going to Stanford and signing a 10-day contract with Dallas, and has the old school Mavericks writing with the letterhead on their old logo at the top. So it's really nice looking, and he seemed very appreciative that we were able to track something down for his mother.
Oh, I love that. That's fantastic.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, I really enjoyed that episode too. And yeah, he and I have like sporadically kept in touch and other things too. So he's a very nice guy, and I'm really glad that I was able to connect with him. A couple more questions here. I know I'm running a little bit longer than I initially planned, but I really appreciate your time, Adam. As I was going over your website, I found a clip of you. I guess you were a kid, and it ended up on some kind of the equivalent of America's Funniest Home Videos.
Yeah.
What's the story behind that? Like, how did that all happen?
First of all, that was filmed by my brother's now wife, Tanya. So hello to Tanya. Hello to Luke while I'm at it. She filmed that. I don't know how we coerced her to even come along and get the video camera out, but we must have paid her, surely. It was some long forgotten game. I don't even know when it was, back in the 1990s sometime. And it was at our local basketball stadium in a place called Bendigo in the state of Victoria. She happened to be still filming right towards the end of either the half or the end of the game. I can't recall what it was, but some guy just threw up a 30-foot brick, and I just happened to be under the basket just waiting for the rebound to come to me. And as soon as I grabbed it, I just threw a hook shot. This is a 90-foot hook shot. Hit the top of the backboard, went up and then hit the light up above the backboard, and then dropped back down and went into the basket. So that was my 5 seconds of fame. I think the guy who announced it, like the voiceover guy, it's for a show called Australia's Funniest Home Videos. The guy says something like, how to go from nobody to somebody in 5 seconds or something like that. And sure enough, that was my fleeting moment of fame, mate.
That's really funny. And it actually, I don't know if you've ever seen it. There is a shot that's very similar to that happened in NBA history maybe around the year 2000. Kendall Gill had a shot like that where it hit the top of the backboard, went really high, and then came right back down through the net. He shot it from like just beyond half court.
Was he with the Nets at the time?
Yes, he was. Yeah, he was with the Nets.
Okay. That vaguely does ring a bell, and I just wanted to confirm if I was in the right era. Well, if I've got any chance to link myself to the great Kendall Gill, who's a former guest on my podcast, dare I say, shameless self-promotion.
Oh, that's really cool. I didn't know you had him on there. That's awesome.
Yeah, had Kendall on there. And actually, a quick story about Kendall. And so that's good that I happen to have a shot that slightly resembles an NBA great. I recorded my conversation with Kendall. It was about a 45, 50-minute conversation, and then I pressed stop on the recorder. Thanks, Kendall, for chatting. It's been fantastic. I'll let you know as soon as the episode goes online. Hang up on Skype. Go to play back the file, and it just was all garbled and could not make sense of any of the audio from his end. It was completely just lost. and I was freaking out. I was sweating. I thought, oh, no, I've just ruined my one chance to connect with Kendall Gill. So I messaged him back about 20 minutes later and said, Kendall, I'm so sorry. The audio has malfunctioned and none of what you've said has been recorded. And I felt terrible. And then he replied back within about 20 minutes from that and then said, okay, let's do it again tomorrow.
Wow.
My episode that's online now is actually a redo of the conversation we did a day prior. I changed a couple of the questions up and made them a little bit different in topics because he would have just been repeating himself. But he was so generous. He didn't owe me a thing. And yet he went out of his way to let me re-record the next day and gave up another hour of his time. So that sort of shows you some of the generosity of these players who have been in the spotlight for years. Some of them, in some cases, are big stars like Kendall was. Others are lesser known, but they give you opportunities just to be able to reminisce about their career and also help you out at the same time, just with your love of the game. And it's a really cool thing about the podcasting medium that I think sometimes is overlooked. These guys that give us their time, so muchly appreciated.
Absolutely. And I have one somewhat similar circumstance with me. It wasn't a recording issue, but I try to focus on some players that most fans may not remember either at all or remember that they were a Maverick. But one of the former Mavericks following my Instagram account was Josh Howard, who was a little bit past your time as an NBA fan, but he was a core piece of the Mavericks in the 2000s, second best player on their 2006 finals team. And he was an all-star in 2007. He was liking and commenting on photos. And so I sent him a direct message. I said, you're typically not the person that I'm looking to get as a guest, but would you be interested in coming on my show? I'm a huge fan of yours, and I would really enjoy talking to you. He said, sure, that's fine. So we set a time, and he called in, and then he mentioned how he was going to be attending a high school basketball game. We were just talking about our like holiday plans or something. He said, I'm going to be in Richardson High School tomorrow night attending a high school basketball game for a family friend. And I actually live right behind Richardson High School. Just pure coincidence. I said, you're going to be maybe 200 yards from my house. Like, could I possibly come meet you and maybe take a picture with you? And if you signed a couple things for me, I'd really appreciate it. He said, absolutely. So we met up in the parking lot and we took a picture together and he signed some stuff for me. And one of them is a Mavericks ornament on our Christmas tree signed by Josh Howard. I just put it up on the tree earlier this past weekend. So
is that the one that you showed the photo of on Twitter?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. How cool is that? That's fantastic. That's really good to hear a story like that. And from someone who is such a prominent player as well. I'm definitely obviously familiar with Josh Howard, but yeah, that's a really great story. And it shows you how generous and affording of their time they can be, even though they're held to such a high regard in terms of what they've achieved professionally.
That was just a really cool moment for someone that just lives and breathes Mavericks basketball, and it meant a lot to me. Even though I was like a 31-year-old man at the time, I felt like I was like 8 years old for a second there. It was great.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And the feeling that you get when you connect with one of those guests, I'm not sure if it's the same for you, but as the Skype call or whatever it might be, Zoom, when you're calling and then it rings and then they answer and then they sort of say hello and then you sort of say, oh, hello, I'm in Australia, how are you? I get so nervous sometimes when I'm chatting to those guys, and I don't know why after all this time, but I still get quite excited and nervous at the prospect of chatting to them. Maybe I'm revealing too much about my own.
No, not at all. Speaking of just how nice these guys are, like I did episodes with Martin Mearsip and Chris Anstey, and Martin just randomly out of the blue, we hadn't talked in months. He sent me a message and he said, hey, Chris and I are going to be in Dallas, these 3 days in late September. Just wanted to let you know in case you're able to meet up with us. And I thought that was fantastic. So, I said, absolutely. So I was able to go and have a few beers with them in downtown Dallas and got to hang out with them for a couple hours. And they were actually filming a Estonian documentary on Martin and all of the cities he played in as a professional. So I was tagging along for some of the Dallas portion of their filming. It was so cool how it all happened so randomly. They bought me some beers and I bought them a beer for coming on the show. They were just so nice, and he did not need to let me know he was coming to Dallas at all. I hadn't spoken to him in months.
Australia's own Chris Anstey too, I must say.
Yeah.
That would have been Chris's rookie season, I think, that Martin was. They were teammates, I guess, during
Correct.
Chris's rookie season. Yeah.
Yep, in Dallas, yeah.
Yeah, 97, 98, I think.
I think I just have one last question for you. Like I said, thank you so much, Adam. It was really cool to hear your story, and I know we've interacted a bit over the last year, so I'm really glad we were able to do this tonight.
Thank you for having me on, mate. I really appreciate it. I love talking NBA history, so anytime.
So this is just, I like to do a roster quiz with some of my Mavericks guests, but I know you're most well known for being a Bulls fan. So you mentioned you went to a Bulls game in 1994. So I'm looking at the 1994 regular season roster for the Bulls.
Wow, okay.
16 names on it. I wanted to see how many you could do for 94.
Corey Blunt, definitely is on there. BJ Armstrong. Who we got? Steve Kerr. Well, let me think of the most well-known. Tony Kukoc. Gee, I'm blanking. That's not good. Luke Longley, of course.
Yeah.
Johnny Paxson. Scottie Pippen. How can I forget Pippen? Bill Wennington. I think it was his first season with the Bulls. I don't know if Scott Williams was still on the team at that stage.
He is there, yeah.
Oh, he is there. Okay, good. Have I said BJ Armstrong?
Yes. You only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 left.
Bill Cartwright would have been still there.
Correct.
1994. I'm thinking of the playoffs. Joe English was on the team.
Yep.
Because he got into that fight with Derek Harbour in the 94 postseason. Horace Grant.
There you go. Four more. Okay. Will Perdue. There you go.
And I'm going to kick myself when I realise who I've missed. How many do I have left? Sorry.
Just 3. I'd only heard of 2 of these 3 that are remaining. There's one guy I haven't heard of.
Pete Myers would be on there.
Yep. I'm familiar with Pete. I actually met him in Chicago when I lived there.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah.
I love Pete Myers. He was back on the Bulls roster back, I think, 87. He was there for one season. So.
Oh, wow.
I've said Tony Kukoc, surely.
Yes.
Okay. No, I'm blanking on who the others are.
Sure. You just got 2 left. You got someone named Dave Johnson. I have not heard of him. I don't know who that is.
Oh, wow. Okay. No, I wouldn't have got that one. I'll have to have a look into that. Yeah, Dave Johnson. Okay.
And then Stacey King.
Stacey. Oh, dear. Of all the players I could leave out, Stacey King. Yeah, okay. He was a key part of the team back in the first three-peat for sure, and I didn't know if he was still there or had gone to Minnesota or wherever he got traded to after that.
Former Mav, too, Stacey King, in 97, maybe, very briefly.
Okay. I'll have to definitely look into Dave Johnson and see more about him. He mustn't have played more than a couple of seasons. That name doesn't actually ring a bell. That'll give me my next lot of research to look into Dave Johnson.
2-year NBA career. Looks like in 93 he was with Portland, and 94 he was with Chicago. Only 17 games with the Bulls. I wasn't sure what I was going to ask. I hadn't even decided until maybe like 10 minutes ago. Once you mentioned you went to a game in 94, I said, oh, that'd be cool to ask him about that team.
Love talking about old school basketball.
As do I. Well, thank you so much, Adam. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Great chatting to you, Mike, and wish you all the best as well for what's to come with your podcast and the future guests that you're going to get the chance to speak with as well, mate. Good on you.
Thanks a lot, Adam.
No worries, mate. Thanks for listening. I welcome your interaction with the show. Suggest topics or guests you want to hear conversations with. Leave a voicemail. Simply visit inallairness.com/voice. Click Start Recording, leave your message, and press Stop. You can even listen back before submitting. Press Send, and you're done. Time now to share another great review from a fan of the show. This time thanks to the Cliff Dog on Apple Podcasts Australia. It's titled Sensational, and it reads, Awesome NBA podcast. Great history lesson. Thank you very much, Mr. Dog. I sincerely appreciate you supporting my show, mate, and I'm quietly confident that's not your real name. Worldwide, the show currently has upwards of 75 reviews on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for your continued support. As I like to say, if you do add a review, I'd love to read it out on a future episode. Your ratings and reviews are certainly one of the best ways you can support the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please do tell your basketball-loving friends about it. Word-of-mouth recommendations are worth their weight in gold. Stay up to date with my podcast and subscribe to my monthly email newsletter. You'll receive exclusive details on upcoming podcast episodes, future high-profile guests to appear on the show, and much more. Simply visit inallairness.com/news. You can subscribe to my show in various ways. Search for In All Airness, 3 words, on your podcast app of choice. The show is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Overcast, Android, Pocket Casts, and more. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show and share my web address with your friends and colleagues, inallairness.com. Check out the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with high-profile guests. Follow me on Twitter at inallairness. Please add your like to the show's social hub, facebook.com/inallairness. Join me next time for another edition of the show.